a company I was working with, a bookstore, moved me to Phoenix. And then from Phoenix to Sierra Vista to Flagstaff for 2 months, and it was too damn cold. So then moved to Tucson. After, when it snowed in April, it was like, that was it. I was done with, I was like, no cold, no. So then I've lived in Tucson since 1981 or so. Somewhere right in there.
And then we had to have snow in April for you one year, huh?
So it's amazing how just a few hours up a road can change everything, isn't it?
Especially in Arizona.
Especially in Arizona. As soon as you head up towards the rim in that direction, suddenly everything changes in remarkable ways. Dan, you're here just a bit late, and so I'll tell you what everyone else did. They just introduced themselves, said, this is who I am, and here's the places I've lived. And so if you'll just give us a list of the places you've lived and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, Dan Butcher. Born and raised in Tyler, Texas. That conservative, redneck, Louis Gohmert territory, East Texas. Do you know who Louis Gohmert is? He's like one of the most far right-wing representatives, and I can't stand him. So I was going to go to University of Texas earlier, but my dad decided that I should stay and go to Tyler Junior College for 2 years. And unfortunately, that's where I got into trouble with drugs and got a record started, Unnight poured itself for drugs. But anyway, I'm beyond that now.
Don't give us all the details yet. We'll get back to that later.
So I moved to, so I went to Austin for University of Texas for my junior and senior year, and I loved the place at the time. I got a master's, and I stayed in Austin for, golly, a long time, as I was working afterwards, after I got out of university. And I finally decided that it was getting too expensive, too much humidity, too many allergies, too much traffic, too big. So I said, man, I got to figure this out. I've been trying to move to a place like Tucson for like almost 2 years. Finally decided the time was right when they were going to move my rent up to where I could possibly not afford it. So I said, okay, I'm doing it. So I finally had enough courage to put everything in a U-Haul and come on out here. Found a nice 2-bedroom for less than I was paying for one in Austin. So I've only been here, like, I guess since the very late part of May, about 7 months or so. And I love it. So I mean, that's basically it. It's just Tyler, Austin, and Tucson, except for 3 months that I lived when I was working up in Iowa City in Burr. Yeah. That was cold. It was February and March.
Nice. Thank you. Now the thing of it is Dan wasn't here for the first instruction, so he gave more details than you wanted. But how many wanted more details about some of the other people as they told their stories? Or how many wanted to make your connections between you and them? For example, when Dan mentioned Tyler, Texas, I wanted to say, oh, that's where Hank had the big accident 2 summers ago, right? And
I wanted to talk about Theo, New York.
And so we like to be able to have those connections. We like to be able to hear those stories. That's a very typical thing to do. Sometimes the places we've lived aren't necessarily good stories. How many have at least one story where this is what happened there? Maybe it was a divorce. Maybe it was an accident like Hank or something like that. And it's not a particularly pleasant place in your head because of that. But how many also have some of those spaces that are the mixed bags of pleasant and unpleasant?
Oh, yeah.
Right? And those stories underneath it are important to us because we remember those things because those are the changing places within us. Marcus Borg talks about how this is going to be framed. This book is going to be framed by three things: memories, conversions, and convictions. And so all those memories that we have, they give space for the conversions, for what changes in us. And those places of changes, not always easy or big changes, but changes of all different sorts are what give definition to life, aren't they? So I want you to go back to your story and tell us just one place. Don't tell us the whole story about that place. Don't even tell us a big story about that place, but tell us one thing that happened that made it so you were different because of that place. So for example, I might talk about when I was in Fort Collins, Colorado, that's when I began running. Well, I began running, basically my mom would say when I was born, but when I began running on teams, and it changed my relationship to running. And it made it so I looked at that activity differently than what I had before that. So tell us about one of the places and some place where it changed you.
Well, I'll start with something. I was trying to think of something interesting, but the Grand Tetons, when I was there in the summer, I got to meet Norman Rockwell, and he was there visiting, and my friend pointed him out, and I said, well, I can't let this go by. So I went over and shook his hand and thanked him for his art. And I have gone on and taught art and taught about him, and it was just a really cool thing to meet him before he died. And then I was able to go to his home, and it's now a museum, but all 365 covers of the Saturday Evening Post are in the basement. So that meeting of him made his art really stand out more.
Yeah. And we're going to talk later about the people who meet us in some of those places, because they are absolutely essential to some of those conversion spaces that we have, right? Who walks with us and how they walk with us is important, aren't they? How about the rest of you? What's one change space for you?
I guess for me, it was my image in the eyes of my parents. Basically, one of three boys and the eldest, I was supposed to be, the one who sets the example, the one who's always doing the good. I mean, I was a straight A student, and always involved in worthwhile little clubs and stuff. But then I got, then when I had the marijuana thing going on and got in trouble, and my parents was like, it spoiled their image of me, but it also made me realize that I do not have to live up to anyone else's image of myself, and I know that I'm flawed and I'm not perfect. And I think in that point, it changed me enough to realize that I can accept life as it is, not as I see it or as my parents see me.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was like a kind of a shocking realization that came to me after that event.
And thank you for sharing that, Dan, to remind us a couple of different things. First of all, that not all changes that we have are necessarily of the positive nature completely, right? Sometimes when we talk about conversions, we talk about only I changed from, I once was lost, but now I'm found type of change. And that's not all those kinds of change. And especially, thank you for reminding us that what somebody else views as a negative change, or even what you might view partially as a negative change, isn't just that. For example, if you went through a divorce, that's not always just a difficult place. I mean, it's a difficult place as you're going through, but as you go beyond it, it sometimes becomes that place where you alter yourself completely into the new thing you're going to be. And so it becomes a positive as you move forward.
Yeah, John O'Donohue says that we have to embrace and be kind to the negative parts of us so they can be transformed and we can learn how to use them in harmony with the other ones.
Nice, thank you. Sorry, Steve just told me that the new air conditioning heating unit in that we had to put up just got finished. So that was good news. You're right, Dan. Thank you for sharing that. The rest of you, tell me about one place of change for you.
Well, two things came up for me, and the one I'm selecting is outside of Pittsburgh, the Frank Lloyd Wright House, Falling Water.
Mhm.
And so I've always been kind of, even early on, leaning towards spirituality, and it totally opened up my awareness that I could be so moved just by a structure.
Yeah, it's a pretty impressive structure, but you're right. That to be moved by it is an impressive thing, isn't it? Thank you. Judith?
Well, for me, it was each place changed me.
Uh-huh.
I mean, each place I've lived has changed me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the first place that changed me drastically was when I was in Vista in rural West Virginia. And I was 18 years old and I had what I call Joan of Arc syndrome. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could save the world.
Mm-hmm.
I was a poverty worker. I joined a poverty organization. I've been involved in poverty work since I was like 16. And I went into this and I lived with a family at the end of this holler. And literally ran myself ragged. And came out of it with malnutrition, and literally was sick and in hospital the first couple of weeks I was my freshman year in college after that. So I lost my Joan of Arc syndrome in Clendenin, West Virginia.
There you go. There you go. Judith, how about you?
Well, when you said the negative transformation, what came to my mind was San Francisco, where I kind of got into drugs, and the only men that I found to relate to were the gay men. So the lifestyle that I saw there was the one night stand type lifestyle. When I came back to Tucson and people were talking about wanting to get married, it was like, gay people want to get married? That's not the way the guys were in San Francisco.
Yeah.
But it was like the divorce didn't work out, and I contacted my husband and came back to live with him then. And so it was like my whole life changed from that experience living up there.
Yeah. And as we go through some of those places, there's times when we want to have stepped back, but I want you to go way back to your growing up space, right? Wherever it is that you first lived. And what if you'd never left that space?
Oh my.
I'd be dead.
Yeah. What would be different about you today?
I'd be dead.
Yeah.
Literally, I would be dead.
Yeah.
I would probably lose my sanity because I've been living in an oppressive type, Republican conservative community all my life. I would never have been able to come to be myself.
Yeah.
As a worthwhile gay man in Tucson,
Yeah.
that would have been pretty much of a disaster for me.
Yeah. I was born in this little teeny place in northwestern Nebraska. If you go straight south from Mount Rushmore, that's about where it's at. It's called Fort Robinson, and literally, it is a state park today. When we lived there, it was a recently decommissioned army post. The army post where Crazy Horse was killed, because that's where all the Sioux Wars originated from. So there were neat things about it as a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. When would some of that neatness, that distance from everything else, when would that have been hard for a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 30-year-old, right? But to do that, you have to leave that place. And I mean, not just the city where you grew up, but you also have to leave some of who you were up to that point behind. And so there's moving conversions of different sort, aren't there?
Mhm.
And each of those places of conversion, each of those new learnings that you have to go through, you figure out that the old rules don't work the same,
Mm.
that you have to reevaluate in some way or another. You do that when you move from 6th grade into middle school,
Mm.
right? Rules kind of change. You do that if you've ever made a change of denomination, right? You go to a Lutheran church, and instead you go over to the Catholic Church. You do that as you step into different relationships, and you realize that something has to happen. And it's not that your old learnings were bad. When I was in Argentina, I knew Spanish really well, and I spoke it all the time when I was in Argentina. Then I came up to Glendale, Arizona, and I began teaching first, second, and third graders, bilingual students. And they spoke Mexican instead of Castellano, right?
Mm.
Different Spanish. And they taught me, their maestro, they taught me so many things because they came at what I already knew from a very different point of view. And I learned so much from them, especially in the first couple of years of doing that. Borg, in this book, in the first 3 chapters, talks about some of his conversions. All right. In chapter 2, he talks about a conversion that was intellectual, but also religious. And then one that was political, but also religious. And then one that was a religious conversion. And so I want you to read through those, especially in chapter 2 and chapter 3, to see what his conversions are, and then try to figure out some of what your conversions are. What are some of the places where you had to be something different than what you were? So one of mine, for example, happened, well, before I came to Arizona, but as I moved to Arizona, it definitely became more acute. And that was right around 1984, as I looked at what Ronald Reagan was doing as a president. And my mama had raised me to be a good Republican. And as that moved along, I was realizing that's not quite describing me. But that's not quite who I am. And I had to figure out, who am I politically? Especially because I was living in a small town that is very conservative in Northeast Arizona. And that for sure was not the description of who I was. And I had to figure out what was next. So tell me about one of your conversions. Not a big one, because we're gonna, after we read these chapters, I want you to go to some of your big conversions. Tell me about the other things where you essentially say, I used to be, but now I am whatever it happens to be. What are some of those things for you? Go
So
ahead.
this is Judith, and I was raised in a liberal Presbyterian church, and then as a teenager, to rebel against my parents, I became Plymouth Brethren and was really fundamental literal. And then when I got to college, it was like, well, religion is bunk. So there was none for many years. And then I went to Catalina Methodist Church. And in San Francisco, I went to Glide Methodist Church, which was really progressive and liberal. And then that seemed to make St. Francis fit that. So it was a progression.
Thank you. And those religious journeys from this church to this church to this church are important ones. And sometimes we want to go back and say, well, I could never be that. And that's maybe true from your current perspective, right? But I think of Brother Larry, who was the Baptist minister in a small Southern Baptist church up in rural Arizona. And he was essential to my spiritual journey. And I'm guessing that politically right now, he would not agree with me, or maybe even understand me, or want to understand me. But I hold him so dear in my heart because at that moment that I needed him, he was right there and walked with me on the journey I was taking. And that church, that little Southern Baptist church, was essential to my walk. How about the rest of you? Tell me about some of your conversions.
I guess mine was real similar to yours, Jim. I was raised by a Republican father and campaigned for, even with a child, I helped him in the booth campaigning for Goldwater. And then I campaigned openly and voted one time at least for Richard Nixon. And then before I, found out about his being a crook, I was like, felt like I was kind of sheltered. I didn't really know a whole lot about the other side. Anyway, that sort of bothered me a lot with Watergate. And I guess that was the beginning of my transformation to being a progressive Democrat, when I looked at how the Reagan trickle-down theory didn't even work, really. And also because the Republicans were very, very homophobic, and I was like, trying to say it was a phase in my life, and then I figured out, no, I really am gay. And that sort of also propelled me over to the Democrats, who were more liberal about that. Mm-hmm. So it's like a combination conversion of me accepting myself as well as seeing the Republican Party for what it really was.
Yeah. At least part of what every conversion at least starts at, and sometimes it's the whole of the journey, is a defining of what I'm not. I'm not that, so what do I do to find out who I am?
Yeah.
Right? And we often do that in churches, where somebody gives us an example, or the church itself gives us an example of what doesn't feel like God to us. And so it opens our heart to searching for what else can be true.
Yeah, I mean, like even like you said, I was with a group called the Navigators when I went to UT the first time. And even though they were real conservative and wouldn't accept me as I am, being in the closet at the time, they still taught me a whole lot about the Bible.
That's right.
So I really understand a lot about the Bible and how to study it, which I didn't know before. So like you said, it really helped my journey, faith journey.
And Dan, that's important, because a conversion doesn't necessarily mean a negation of or a rejection of what we convert out of. It can also be a building on the best of that as we move towards.
Yeah.
And so, like, as I was moving out of Mormonism, a friend of mine, Joe Cowsey, brought in another Jim named Jim Wright. And Jim Wright is one of the preeminent anti-Mormon scholars. He lives in Mesa, right? And so he tried to convince me of why Mormonism was wrong. What he didn't understand is I wasn't rejecting Mormonism. I was following a voice that was leading me somewhere else. And so conversion doesn't have to be a rejection of where you've come from, so much as a path towards what you're becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it feels. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when I was about 13, I was very involved with the Emmanuel Lutheran Church in North Hollywood. And we went to a Billy Graham event, and thousands of people. And, if you want to be saved, come down. And, so I did that when I was like 13. And all my friends were doing that too. Like we were saved. And I really moved away from the Lutheran Church, especially when I got to be about 16. I started seeing it just doesn't fit. Everything was so literal and conservative, and my parents weren't. And I just didn't, it's kind of like clothes that fit right, and this one didn't on me. And yet some of my best friends that I still am in contact with were in that group in Emmanuel Lutheran, and we communicate almost weekly. But there are lots of ways to read the Bible. One is literally and one is metaphorically, and yet the message seems to be similar about love. And it's like a different language almost, the way you interpret that. But I've never been quite clear, or it confuses me, the whole idea of salvation. What does that mean? I don't even know exactly. Like Jesus died on the cross for our sins. I don't understand that.
Yeah.
And why? And what are they? And anyway, you think by now I get that, but I haven't. I don't
Well,
understand.
but part of the reason why you don't get it is because that's delving into areas that aren't important to you. Does that make sense? That aren't the ones that you've built your meaning making on. And somebody else has more decided that this definition of salvation is how meaning making happens. And so they listen to that type of voice more and more, and they build up more reasons to be in that space.
Yeah. And I went to a Catholic church for a while in Tacoma. It was progressive, but I never understood, why do they always have Jesus on the cross? If he's resurrected, it seems like it should be an empty cross. That would be one thing.
How
But
very Protestant of you.
Yeah, it is. But I was telling my cousin the other night about when I was meditating, I tried to imagine Jesus sitting in the room with me, and even what would he look like, what would he be wearing, what would he say to me. And what I try to do is follow the teachings of Jesus. I'm not saying I'm always perfect with that, but that's the whole idea of choosing love and forgiveness and life after death. Those are the kind of the main three in my desires to feel at peace with this existence. And so that's one reason why I'm taking the class, is I want to hear what you and others have to say about those questions.
Well, and one of the big things that we're going to do is we're each going to share our journeys with each other. I hope this class becomes one where you become very comfortable in sharing what you've gone through and why you've gone through it, so that others can frame their own journey with your view of things in mind as well. Not because your journey will give any of us perfect illumination to our own journey, but it'll give us some help. It'll give us some show. It'll give us some reasons why you did something, and how that gives some voice to us. Yes, Judy.
I dabbled with my grandmother when I was a child in Southern Baptist, but I never really bought into it or anything. But I didn't really go to church or have any kind of religious thing until I was probably in my mid 30s or so. And a friend took me to Calvary Chapel here in Tucson. And then I left because I kind of looked into different religions. I was interested in all of them. So, but I didn't know anything about the Bible. So I thought, well, I would go there and maybe learn about the Bible. But I got a whole different message out of the Bible than what they were teaching. Mm-hmm. When I had a young man in my life who was gay, and they were like condemning me because I wasn't telling him he was going to hell if he didn't quit being gay. And he was 9 years old at the time. He wasn't even, it's like he just knew he was gay. And it was like, so I left them, and then I ended up going to another evangelical church when I was at St. Luke's, just because they were nearby. And I think part of it is they're very good at creating a sense of community, though. They're very, very good at, like, there was always small groups. You go to other people's homes and in small groups and stuff. And so you had smaller families that got together. Uh-huh. There was like, it was, the allure of that was something that I guess I've always been looking, since I never really had a close family unit or anything, a family kind of thing. But then I left that evangelical church in 2016 when they were like all for Trump. And I was like, I just was like, whatever you're teaching, I'm not drinking that Kool-Aid. And so then I literally Googled progressive churches in Tucson.
Mhm.
St. Francis came up.
Good.
And I happen to live right up the road from St. Francis. So here I am.
Mhm.
That's cool.
And I'm like you, Nancy. I had an experience one time where I had pericarditis and I was deathly ill. I couldn't handle, it was like having a heart attack 24/7. I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't listen to music. I could not handle any sound. I couldn't move. I literally had to crawl to go to the bathroom. I barely ate anything. And it was like, I had these, okay, this is even recorded. Okay, here goes. I had conversations with Jesus because that's always been the person in religion that spoke to me, kind of. And he and I just sat and talked for a long time. And one of the things he told me was he was embarrassed that Christians thought he was the son of God. That embarrassed him. And it was like, I just had this really strong sense of justice and what it is in the world and what it's like. Unlike you, Nancy, to me, it's what his teachings are that matter. That's the only part of religion that actually means anything to me, I guess.
Right. But what you're talking about is, I think, exactly what the Bible calls us to do. The Bible isn't a book of rules. It is a book of stories that invites us into that story. And Jesus essentially says, what if you were walking down the road to Damascus and you see a guy on the side of the road who's been beaten by thieves? What are you going to do? And it invites you into those stories. It invites you to say, how are you like King David? And how would you make a different decision? Right? All those kinds of stories are important stories. Those are what Borg is talking about when he talks, first of all, about our memories, but also about our conversions, those spaces in our life that draw us to something different and change us. He said, for example, that divorce isn't necessarily a conversion space, but it is a possibility of one, right? Because it can make it so that we convert in the positive sense to something better than what we were before. We can just become the very same thing and marry the same type of person all over again and get in the same kind of trouble all over again, right? Because I haven't changed and I've chosen the same kind of person again. Or that can be a place where, what do I do so that I'm not that? So I become something more.
Oh, speaking of, just a question I had. We're supposed to have the book. I mean, because I don't know where should we order it from Amazon or?
You can order it from Amazon, but here's what I'm going to do, Dan. I will, at the end of class, I need you to, if you will, get me your email address. Just, you can put it in the chat and I can cut and paste it. And then what I will do is I will send you the first 5 chapters. If you don't need a copy of them, you don't have to ever get it. Because at the end of okay, so this week I'm kind of doing chapter 1, chapter 2, a little bit in chapter 3, and we'll move more into that and towards chapter 4 and 5 by next week. But more important than that is that if you want it, just know, you give me your email and I'll get it to you so you can read it. But more important is that we're going to be talking about what those chapters mean and how we apply them to ourselves and how we have whatever journeys he went on and whatever what convictions he arrived at will help us to have the convictions that will help us the most.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So that's kind of how we'll do it. Anybody else who wants to share some of your conversion story, so to speak?
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit. I really had a problem with the question of conversions, and I really appreciated you annotating that question with it isn't something necessarily you reject or you leave behind. You move forward, you add on to it. So that really made a big difference for me.
Let me tell you, one of my favorite spaces of conversion for me. When I first came down to the desert, must have been about 1989. I ended up in this little Lutheran church, Wisconsin Synod Lutheran. If you know Wisconsin Synod Lutheran, Wells Lutheran is very conservative, very stuck in the, and the pastor of this church was a young man whose father happened to be the president of the whole denomination. And by the way, I learned 20 years later, a childhood friend of Ross Brody.
Hello.
So Philip was his name. And it didn't take me long to realize that this church, I called it the Taco Bell church because it looked that way, was not the right church for me. But Philip was absolutely the right person for me for those months that we walked together. And we met every Tuesday and we sat and talked about things. And he helped me so much on my journey, even while I knew that I couldn't be in that denomination or in that church with him. And he knew that as well. He was willing to be with me and guide me through that part of my journey. What's really interesting is this next, in May, I'm going to go up to Minneapolis to see my son graduate. And while there, I'm going to go to the town where my sons grew up. It's called St. Louis Park. And I'm going to go to a little Lutheran church there, pastored by Philip Mischke. And I'm going to see him. Right? And so people don't have to, I don't have to reject Philip, even though he was the wrong place for me to stay forever. He was a rock that I held on to for a time as the waters swirled around me. And then when it was time for me to let go and go further downstream, it was okay. And it doesn't diminish because I left him. It wasn't a rejection of him.
That's a nice way of putting it. And I think too that we mature in our faith journey as we get older. So like from 13 to 16, that was a huge change psychologically and emotionally for me. And so my faith reflected that as well.
Yeah.
But they say, I'm reading this Sanjay Gupta's book, Keep Sharp, and he's talking about the brain and how it keeps growing until you're like 25. It doesn't mature like the body matures earlier, but the brain not till 25. And I think that's connects with your faith and your beliefs. What you believe in, like Santa Claus at 5, you're not going to believe in at 15. And not that it's Santa Claus, but there is some similarity of what you're going to go for and what you won't go for later on, because you start thinking and analyzing and saying, but wait a minute, what about how the New Testament wasn't written until 50 years after Jesus was dead, And so it's like, what about that? What about all the translations? So you start questioning it, and that's a good thing. And that shows maturity.
One of the things that's really difficult about religion is that one of the things we deal in religion is right answers. We help each other discover some answers that give meaning, give purpose, give vision, all of those things. And we turn them into too easily ultimate right answers. Everyone has to believe them right answers. Right? And when we do that and we say, Judy, unless you believe this, then you're a heretic and you're going to hell. You rightfully say, no, I guess I'd rather go to hell than believe in that or whatever, and what we should know about our right answers is what answers we don't give what we don't give answer to. Because if I hold on to this so strongly, there's something over here that I'm not able to do. Right? And so I need to know that. So as children, as I'm raising the children around me, and they come up to me and they're asking a question over in this realm, I know that my set of answers is not going to give a good answer to that. And so I need to know what to say, go explore this. This will help you to answer some of those. Because otherwise I set myself up as the enemy to that pursuit of knowledge. And you don't want to be that as a human. Well, we kind of sometimes do. Sometimes we like the animosity of being right, so we can define the other person as wrong. But that's really not a good way for us to be. Can we be the ones who are there to help liberate each other to the next answer?
That's the reason why I like this church so much. And the same thing that I had when I was in Austin with Sid Hall and Trinity Methodist, who actually knows some people in this church, by the way. He said, always says in his services, no matter what you believe, no matter what you don't believe, no matter where you come from, you're welcome. And that's the way I feel here too. And I'm glad that, I did find St. Francis for that reason.
And I am glad you do feel that way, because I think that's one of the best gifts we can give to each other, that whether I understand you or not, you are truly welcome here. And maybe I can learn some things from you and through you because of that difference that you are.
And when I decided to leave the evangelical churches, each one of them, the people there would no longer communicate with me, no longer have any friendship with me whatsoever, because I know they will not, their world is very enclosed. And if you don't believe exactly what they believe, I mean, I had people when I left U City that it was like, I had this one woman cry and she goes, I can no longer be your friend and I love you, but I can no longer communicate with you if you're going to leave us. You're not come here anymore. And I was just like, wow, really?
Yeah.
I don't guess that love's not real deep.
Yeah. But just know that that's not an untypical way that we have framed things very often in religion. And somehow we have to help each other be different than that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk kind of like on that point, that when I left Catalina Methodist to Francis, I didn't build a case against them. I just wanted what St. Francis had, but they reacted as if I was finding fault with them. They got defensive that I didn't like what they had, and that wasn't the case.
Right.
It was that I preferred what's over there. But what Judy was saying, it happens to people when they get left. It must be that feeling of being abandoned. I also wanted to underline what Nancy said. I had the same kind of experience, like teenage wanting to be certain, and like I was with the Navigators and memorizing scripture. When I was a teenager, my brain could do it, and it was good for it. But then one grows, like in college, and then it gets to be different, and then you swing back. And one time in Course in Miracles, we were realizing everybody in this class is over 50 years of age. It's like we had to get up to these years in order to let this into our lives. So the whole journey of not geographic, but I can't think of the word I want to say, chronological.
Mentally and emotionally, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So where were you with the Navigators?
Judith, did you hear that question?
That's the kind of scripture that we had after a Billy Graham crusade. They took us through all the Navigators materials, the Bible study.
I went witnessing and had Bible studies with the Navigators. I was wondering if you were involved. This was with the University of Texas campus.
So then when we went to Colorado Springs, we had to see their
Nice.
Headquarters.
I think the hard part is if I'm going down a freeway and I know this is the fastest way to Yuma, and you're busy taking an exit that I know is a much slower way or much more tedious way or whatever it happens to be, I try to change you and I try to say, get back on the freeway with me. And the reality is that however good my pathway is, it is not the only way to get from here to there. And do we give each other permission to be able to do that?
You know, the other thing I was going to mention, Jim, you get to the point where it's a mystery. You just don't know. You know, this is like a huge deal, life and death and what's next. And it's like, okay, I don't get it. There's nothing, even, you know, if you're very conservative in your beliefs with the Bible, it's too much to just stop there. It's like, okay, there is something to having faith, because, you know, making the leap, because there's so much that's understandable.
I think with awareness, there's different levels. And I think also we don't know what we don't know. So I could be at a certain level and I don't know what I don't know. And all of a sudden I have more awareness. I'm at a different level. Yeah. And now what I don't know is at a different level also.
Yeah.
I think the more we know, the more we know that we don't know.
Yeah.
I think for me, the way I make sense of that is I'm grounded in myself.
Yeah.
I always have that resource of me. And the other story I didn't share about conversion was when I learned to love myself. And I think that's true, because there's always going to be things different ways, you know. I don't know, for me, there's lots of solace in I don't know what I don't know, which means I'm always open to everything.
Yeah.
And I like that, because it's like, I've been studying a lot in Buddhism recently, and that's a very Buddhist concept of, I'm doing a lot of meditation with self-compassion. And that has changed a lot of how I view the world and everything, because you really can't, that's a huge mindset change. It really is, to have self-compassion and love yourself. And that doesn't mean in a like, you know, I'm stuck on myself or anything, but just that this deep awareness that I'm okay right where I'm at. I'm okay right now with what I'm doing and what I am. And I think I look at all religion now more as I take out of it the philosophy that I love.
Yeah.
I leave the religion and take kind of it's like with Buddhism, I don't see it not as a religion, but as a practice, as something that is a philosophy more. And I kind of see all religions that way, I guess.
Well, and the hard part sometimes, Judy, is it's not always just what you see either. It's what the other person sees. For example, when I essentially made my journey in broad terms from Mormonism to Methodism, my mama, who when she was in high school went from Methodism to Mormonism, had a harder time understanding that journey, because it seemed like I was going backwards on the road that she had chosen. And so it almost by definition looked like the wrong path for her, you know, the wrong path for me to take, because it was the different path than what she took. And so we have to figure out how to, in the midst of those journeys, be able to still communicate with each other. How would I, for example, talk today with Brother Larry, who was so instrumental in my journey, or Pastor Philip, right? There's probably things that I wouldn't try to make them understand about my journey, you know, because I would want to stay on how they helped me and the gratefulness I had there. So let me help you as we move into next week, because I want you to tell me more about your conversion stories. And I'm going to tell you 2 parts of the book to be able to look at. First of all, sits on the pages 9 through 16. And these are 5 categories of American Christianity that he outlines. and says, here's what, here's kind of some broad ideas of where people are at. And so he talks about conservative, conventional, uncertain, former, and progressive. And I want you to kind of look at those things. And when I send out stuff, I will send a copy of this little summary to you, but you can read the whole thing on those pages 9 through 16. And if you'll look at those and kind of say, where did I start? How did I move through? What were some of my steps on that journey? Okay. And then he puts that up, and then he tells his 3 conversion stories. And after he tells those 3 conversion stories, then he talks about William James and the book, The Variety of the Religious Experience. And he talks about how the religious experience is multitude. It's not a singular thing. And so he talks about the different ways that people have religious experience. And so it gives you a framework to be able to say, oh yes, that's true of my journey. Or at this point, as I took this step, it was because of this kind of experience. So if either of those 2 documents, and that all of that is outlined on page 39 in the book. But if either of those help you to define your own journey, that's good. Because whether I think that was a good conversion or a bad conversion doesn't matter, because it was you going through it that changed from here to here. Whatever that change was, that's what we want to hear. Why was that an important step for you?
I appreciate that, because my book group about a year ago actually studied a book group, which is from Austin. We actually studied the varieties of religious experience. It did say a lot, but it was kind of hard to get through it because of its writing style, but it was definitely worth it.
It's not a light book.
Mm-mm.
But kind of use that to kind of frame your own story. Also think about the people who were there. The people like the ones I've shared, who, whether or not they would agree with you today, whether or not they would help you today on where you're at in your current journey, who is there to be guideposts, to be sometimes prophets to you, who is there to be able to, for a short time, be a companion on the road as you walk through life. And then think about basically, what are the places where life converted me and convicted me of something new? What were those moments for you? And as we come together next week, we'll kind of share more about those stories and you know, draw each other deeper into those moments. Then as we go further on in the book, he'll talk about how, because of his journey, here are some ways that he's able to frame his convictions. And I think that what you'll find as relatively progressive people, that many of his convictions will also give voice to some of the convictions you've arrived at. And maybe not perfect voice, but at least give you a place to be able to start on those. Okay?
Cool.
Thank you for your time today. I appreciate you being here with us. I look
Thank
forward
you.
to seeing you
Thank
next
you.
week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.